Good morning, BG4, and everyone that might be choosing to join us this morning. We're so grateful that you are jumping in to be part of community, whether it's online or in person, or maybe you're catching up on what's going on at BG4 this week. I'm Elizabeth, if we haven't met before, and I get the privilege of being one of the pastors at BG4. I wanted to invite you to a couple of things going on this week before we get started with this week's message. This week, we have some cool opportunities. Your kids are invited, kids through 6th grade are invited to Turkey Wars next Sunday, the 21st. Connie, our kids pastor, has all sorts of fun things planned, and your kids can invite their friends and know that they're going to have a great time at BG4 Kids. We also have a cleanup day with the Lions Club at 9 a.m. at Florence Robinson Duck Pond Park on Saturday the 20th. It's a way that we get to serve our community. Our small groups are continuing on. The restoration group for ladies at 6:30 on Thursday nights, led by Renine Royer, is an incredible time to get prayed for, to get refreshed in the middle of your week. That's the highlight for this week. Thank you for your continued giving. Remember, you can give by text or online or in person or by mail and bank by mail. And we just thank you for that. Well, this morning I get to continue our series, and that series is called Making Change. And honestly, we have had so much fun so far with this series. I think Rick and I find teaching about finances to actually have a lot of joy in it, because we've found that when people get this part of their life aligned to God's best, they just thrive in ways they hadn't experienced before, in peace and joy, and in having everything that they need and more to give away. So far we've had less is more, stress is bad. This week we have giving is good, and next week we have tomorrow matters. I heard great things about what Rick taught you last week about stress is bad, something obvious but so true, and what to do about it, that God doesn't intend for us to live in debt. But really, I'm so happy I got the topic giving is good, because I am convinced to my bones that giving is good. It's good for you, the giver. It's good for the receiver. Hey, Jesus actually talked about this. And when Jesus says something, I want to pay attention. He said, it is more blessed to give than receive. You got that? Let's say it again. More blessed to give than receive. So we can take a couple things away from that. Receiving gifts is good. But you know what's even better? Giving, because it's more blessed to give than receive. So all of this talk got me thinking about one of the most profound gifts that I ever received, something really fun and delightful. Well, it was almost 20 years ago. Rick and I were preparing to get married, and we were both poor. We were young, or I was young. And we were poor. Rick had just gotten out of debt. I was living at home with my parents, just starting out in life. And we were planning a honeymoon, but of course we couldn't really afford to go all out. Rick worked at a private bank in Beverly Hills. And there was this gentleman, Asher. Asher was the same age as Rick. At the time, Rick was about 30. But Asher had had a totally different life experience. When Asher had his bar mitzvah at 13, he received a 6-plex apartment complex in New York. So yes, when I was maybe getting a bike or a new pair of shoes on my 13th birthday, Asher was getting his start in real estate. And he grew from there. But the cool thing about Asher was he really believed that God was generous. And it changed the way he thought about his money. He thought about money as a gift from God. And so he would come into the bank. He was everybody's favorite client, because after he did his banking, he'd give them $100 bill and tell them to go out to eat. And Rick says they broke it up into fives because they were poor, even though they worked in Beverly Hills, so they could make it last a long time. Asher would also give to Rick's missions trips. He gave to a trip he was going to Tibet, and he said just to make sure he didn't convert any Jews while he was in the nation of Tibet. But he regularly said, I know that God's generous. I know this is a trust from God, and so I want to be generous. And then when he asked Rick about his upcoming wedding and what he was planning for the honeymoon, and Rick told him we were going to go to Mexico, and he told him his plan to stay at the Hilton, and Asher was not impressed. It wasn't what he thought would be good. So he said, Rick, here is my credit card. I want you to go upstairs into the private office right now, and I want you to book the Ritz-Carlton, and that's going to be my wedding present. Really. He purchased the Ritz-Carlton for us for our honeymoon. Now, we were kids who had not experienced the finer things in life. When we got to the Ritz-Carlton, we felt pretty out of place, but you know what? We adapted and we did okay. And all I can say is we had no way of paying him back. All we could do was receive this incredible gift of grace. I had Asher as a profound picture of grace. And as we talk about generosity today, I would love for you to picture the most generous person you know. I'm going to give you a second right now. Do you enjoy being around him or her? Well, of course you do, because people who open their homes and their hearts, who are givers, are incredibly attractive. The Bible describes the early Christians in the book of Acts, the early Jewish church, as being incredibly generous and hospitable. When there was a need, people would actually sell their resources to make sure that every need was covered. There was an opening of homes and sharing of food and making sure that no one was in want. And that became incredibly attractive to outsiders, and Christianity spread like wildfire, this message about a generous God. And his followers also acted with grace and generosity. But the passage that we're going to read today takes place about 20 years later. It is written to the church in Corinth, and the church in Corinth was mostly Greek, Gentile, non-Jewish. And they didn't grow up knowing or being taught about generosity. In fact, Greeks would have thought of religion in terms of mystical experiences much more than like practical generosity and giving sacrificially towards someone else's needs. They didn't grow up in a quote unquote Christian home or a Jewish home, and no one taught them about giving and about grace in that way. And so Paul is bringing them along and teaching them what it means to follow Jesus. And some of us also might be new to generosity as well. And Paul wants all of us to understand that giving is good. So let's read 2 Corinthians 8, 7 to 11 together. And then I'm going to skip to chapter 9, verses 6 to 8. Since you excel in so many ways, in your faith, your gifted speakers, your knowledge, your enthusiasm, and your love from us, I want you to excel also in the gracious act of giving. I am not commanding you to do this, but I am testing how genuine your love is by comparing it with the eagerness of other churches. You know the generous grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. Though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty he could make you rich. Here is my advice. It would be good for you to finish what you started a year ago. Last year you were the first who wanted to give, and you were the first to begin doing it. Now you should finish what you started. Let the eagerness you showed in the beginning be matched now by your giving. Give in proportion to what you have. Remember this, a farmer who plants only a few seeds will get a small crop, but the one who plants generously will get a generous crop. You must each decide in your heart how much to give. And don't give reluctantly or in response to pressure, for God loves a person who gives cheerfully. And God will generously provide all you need. Then you will always have everything you need and plenty left over to share with others. We get to pass on the grace we've received because giving is good. So first of all, we got three things we're going to talk about today. And the first is this: God is generous. His grace is surprising. The basic concept in the New Testament behind the word grace. And the word grace was used throughout the Greek world for different gifts. It wasn't just a religious word. It was a word used for gifts that surprised and delighted, that went beyond what was expected. And of course, that word charis, grace, is used all throughout the New Testament, and it's used several times in this passage we just talked about generosity. It's something that surprises and delights. Now, it is far too easy for me to think about God in terms of what was modeled at times in my own family. And I tend to get this picture of God that's very influenced by my parsimonious German grandparents. Any of you Germans and Scandinavians have some parents and grandparents who were very, very careful and frugal, and they didn't do extra, they didn't do surprising. And I tend to think of that as being the way that God interacts with me. But what I find out when I open the New Testament is that God goes far beyond what I've experienced in my own family. God likes to surprise and delight us with his grace. And how do we know that? Because God's grace is expressed in Jesus. When Paul uses the word grace, it always comes back to the concrete actions of God in history. It's not some ethereal, philosophical concept that God is full of grace. No, it's what we've seen God do in history on our behalf. And how do we know what God's like? Because of Jesus. God sent Jesus and showed us what this surprising and delightful and over-the-top grace looks like. He didn't tell us when we were in need and couldn't help ourselves to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. He stepped right into the mess alongside of us. And Paul comes back to that when he talks about what generosity looks like. He says, "You know the generous grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. Though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that through his poverty you could become rich." The God of the universe stepped into our human history and mess. And not only that, he came in as a poor person. He knows what it's like to be in need. And he gave up the riches of heaven so that he could give us everything we need. And brothers and sisters, that is what generosity looks like. It's over the top. It can't be repaid. It's delightful. And all we can do is receive it from our generous God. It's especially notable. Paul gives us this verse about him giving up the riches of heaven. He gives us profound theology. It's like the whole gospel in one power-packed sentence. And he's teaching this when he's basically taking an offering. And so he definitely wants to ground our generosity in who God is and God's generosity as expressed in Jesus. Because what we believe about God expresses itself in our practical responses. It really does. Paul is raising money for Jewish believers in need with this offering. And the Greeks grew up being suspicious of Jews. And not only that, in the ancient world, people did not give to those outside their families and their tribe. It was unheard of. It wasn't as global of a society as we live in now. You took care of your own. And so they theoretically believed that they were the family of God now, united with Jewish brothers and sisters. But, it probably rubbed a little bit like, what? I'm supposed to care about what's going on with these poverty-stricken Jewish people back in Jerusalem? And here Paul challenges them. If you really believe you're the family of God, act like it. If you really believe you received incredible grace, respond in generosity. Because what we believe about God comes out in very practical ways in the way that we spend and the way that we give. Rick was in an anthropology class in college that he always talks about because it made such an impact on him. And he was asked to go through a family's garbage. This was clearly before there was as big of an identity theft issue, or else he might have been arrested. But they were assigned to go through some garbage in a neighborhood and reconstruct what they could find out about who a family was, their socioeconomic status, the number of kids, their ages, what their habits were, whether they ate out, whether they cooked at home, what they liked to do with their free time. There was so much to be learned just from their garbage. Now, we're not going to go through each other's garbage, but I want you to consider if there was an investigator looking at your life who had access to your bank register and your calendar, maybe your garbage too, what would they conclude about you? What would they conclude your most important values were? As I've thought about this, I've realized they would conclude that soccer matters to the Sawchucks because we spend so much of our free time and any disposable income towards youth sports and towards soccer. What I hope is that they would also see that we believe in a generous God, and so we give beyond ourselves in our time and in our money. God invites us to be generous, to trust him with our finances. The Corinthians intended to be generous. This letter is a follow-up because a year ago, Paul started to prepare for this offering. This wasn't the kind of thing where he was putting them on the spot and manipulating them. He wanted to give them plenty of time to think about how they would respond and respond from their hearts and respond with sacrificial giving. But it began to be a little bit of a challenge when it was time to actually take the step and follow through. There's always going to be challenges when we stretch ourselves to new obedience. It's like picking up greater weights. It may not feel super comfortable until we get used to it. I believe, just like in the church in Corinth, that just about everybody in this room wants to be generous. You probably believe that giving is good. So what holds us back? Well, I think there's three things that I thought of. First of all, perhaps we're struggling. We're struggling financially. We identify with stress as bad and having some issues with debt like Rick talked about last week, and thus we don't know how to get started. Secondly, we had a bad experience. You know, some of us have experienced manipulation, a little bit of like maybe what you see on TV. Come on, brothers and sisters. You give to God and He's going to give it back to you in a way that feels pushy, that feels slimy, that kind of thing. And so we are a little bit defensive when it comes to giving. Then some of us just have a scarcity mindset. Notice that Paul said this can't be compelled. It needs to be something that comes out of your heart, that's not emotionally manipulated. But I want to look a little bit at this scarcity issue because I've experienced it often in my own life. In fact, I felt it sneak up even as I was preparing this message, and I saw God showing me places where I've been afraid. You see, scarcity is a way of looking at the world as if there's limited resources. And I think I've fallen a little bit back into that because I felt uncertain about the future because of what we've gone through with the pandemic. Scarcity says there's only so much to go around, so I need to carefully protect what I have. And in that setting, we can't afford to give very much away because we're trying to make sure ourselves and our people are secure. But abundance is a mindset that says God owns it all, and what I see is not all there is. And if God is asking me to stretch myself to give more, He's going to provide for it. It's not all on me. And so that's why Paul talks about you will have what you need and plenty to give away to others. And that is something that comes from seeing how big and how generous God is. And many of us need, Proverbs says, the world of the generous becomes larger and larger. Many of us need to look up and allow our world to become as big as our generous God and know that if He's stretching us to give more, He's also going to be with us and providing for that, and we will not end up shortchanged. Think about it. Malachi chapter 3, and you go ahead and look it up later. I'm just going to touch base here very quickly. God is talking to ancient Israel, His people in the Old Testament, about their giving. They had gone through some really difficult times, and because of that, they were very reserved about their giving. They were only giving a little bit. They weren't giving the full 10% that God had said belongs to Him. He'd said, you honor me with the first 10%. And I'm going to bless the 90 to me far more than what you could do with 100. But they were holding back, unsure. And so God actually says this powerful promise. You give what I've asked you to give. And He says in verse 10 of Malachi chapter 3, I will open the windows of heaven for you. I will pour out a blessing so great you won't have room to take it in. Try it. Put me to the test. This is the only place in the Bible where God invites us to test Him. I find that so fascinating. He says, you give this a try and see how it works out for you. Is holding back working out for you, or do you find yourself in a place where you feel like you don't have enough? If that's not working for you, may I challenge you, brothers and sisters, what do you have to lose by trying it the way that God invites you? So I wanted to tell you a story about us. And I find that people who've experienced sacrificial giving often have a crazy story like the one I'm about to tell you, because I think God likes to increase our faith. It doesn't happen always that the blessing is financial. Sometimes it's peace and joy. Sometimes it's God making what we have go the distance of what we need. But for this one, this time, it was a crazy blessing. The year was 2007. We had one child, and I was pregnant with our second. We just started a business. We just bought a house, and the economy was crashing. We had a house that was worth far less than what we paid for. And we'd started a business. Things were going well, but they weren't going well at that moment. And we hadn't budgeted for taxes. And so after we paid our tax bill, I had $93 in my business account, and it was a wholesale buy and sell business. And it didn't look good for how we were going to be able to move forward in a wholesale business in a bad economy with no money. And at the same time, our church was doing a giving campaign aimed at reducing a very big debt that they had so that we could put a lot more money into ministry in the community and the world. And Rick and I both prayed about it, and the number that God gave us stretched us so much. In fact, I would say it scared us. Both of us heard that we were supposed to give $10,000 beyond our regular giving. And we didn't see how that was possible, but we said, God, you do it. So we made that commitment and we gave out of not much. We gave what we had. And then just weeks later, I received one of the biggest deals of my very short career. And you know how big that deal was? $10,000. And of course, we couldn't afford to give it all right then. But that was just the beginning of God growing our business and growing our faith. And in the end, we were actually able to give more than we committed. And we didn't end up shortchanged. God was meeting all of our needs and more. He needed to grow us up to think bigger about what he could do in and through us. And again, I want to say it doesn't always go like that. But God does say, try it, see what happens. And I will tell you that I've never seen anyone regret giving. And we've said it before, if you do, try it. And you can come back to us and say, it didn't go the way that I thought. And we will actually give it back to you. We're willing to do that because God says to try it. Yet 2 weeks later, I was finding God's provision in that. So we planned to give. Paul gave the Corinthians time to plan to give. It wasn't an emotional appeal with, puppies and sad music. He'd given them a year to think about it. We plan our spending and we plan our investing, but we don't always plan our giving. Everybody plans when they're going to spend. I mean, my daughter, I heard her the other day, she has now on a clothes budget, and she was talking about the fact that she chose to buy a jacket at Target that looked a lot like a $200 jacket, but only cost $19. And I'm proud of her because now that it's her money, she's planning how she spends. And I bet if you buy a boat or if you buy an RV or a house or a truck or a gun, you put some time into planning that spending and you probably talk to others about it and see the best way and the best price. What if we put that kind of energy into planning to make our giving the best? Giving is good. Paul also challenged the Corinthians to plan that kind of giving. Some of you also plan to invest. Maybe you're like Rick and I, and we have a certain amount that we take out of our checking account and put in our saving and retirement accounts every month because we know that we need to plan ahead to invest. And we know that what's left over isn't going to be enough. Some of those checking accounts that will round up your dollars and save that for you, it's a great way to save $20, but it's not a great way to save for retirement. And unfortunately, some of us give to God that way. We round up to the nearest dollar. We give him a tip, but we don't plan ahead to give him our first and our best and allow him to astronomically bless the rest of it and give us his peace and joy. Generosity changes the world. There's interdependence. In the Roman Empire, it was unheard of for Jews and Greeks to take care of each other. They were different tribes. They didn't pick up each other's burdens. And so Paul is talking about this interdependence of the family of God, where the trials of the Jews in Jerusalem were to be felt by the Greeks in Corinth who had plenty financially. And they were going to share in what was going on with their family, just as that family had shared with them spiritually. We give to a village in Guatemala and we receive so much blessing from our interaction with them. We give towards different people in this church and different ministries that we may not benefit from directly. But we see God working in and through the whole church, including the kids, the youth, the adults, the seniors. Both groups acknowledge their interdependence. We demonstrate God's generosity to the world. Because it was so unusual that the Jews and the Greeks would take care of each other, it was a signpost that God was up to something new through Jesus in the world. It pointed to how generous God was. He's turning the regular old order of the world where we just take care of ourselves upside down. It changes the giver and the receiver. Biblical generosity is a grace. It's motivated by love and relationship. It brings people from different worlds together. Generosity brings joy to the receiver, but it brings even more joy to the giver. You know, a few years later, well, many years later, after we'd started our business and Asher was many years behind us, but we still remembered the way that he blessed us, we've had some opportunities. At one time, we had some friends who had just lost their business and were living on the other side of the country from their family. And God whispered to us and reminded us of what it was like to receive a surprising and delightful gift. And he challenged us to pay for our friends to be able to take a trip that they needed to go home and see family. And it was such a joy to us to be able to give them a gift somewhat like what we had received in our early years. And it was such a blessing to receive that gift from Asher, but you know what? It's more blessed to give than receive. There's more joy when you get to be the one that gives. This is our story, BG4. We have received a gift of hospitality from our friends, the Episcopalians here at Church of the Holy Spirit. They opened their doors and their hearts to us when we had nowhere to meet, and we were just going to have to be an online church. But then you all have responded by investing your time and your talent and your resources in this building. And I know that they are overwhelmed with gratitude for what we've invested in this property, for the Nehemiah project that's going on as you care for the grounds, for the work that's been done in the courtyard and the student center. And together, we're giving the community of Battleground a sign that points to what God is up to, that church is about people that love their neighbor and love their community, not about people sticking just to their own silos. Last summer, you responded with the opportunity to give 500 backpacks to kids in need in Battleground. I thought it was an incredibly high goal, and you met it so quickly. 2 years ago, we became convinced that God was calling us to reach the students of Battleground, that they were in need of a missionary to serve them. And God provided through a generous member of our congregation who had sold property, who felt on his heart to make that initial investment for 2 years of expanded youth ministry with a missionary who would begin to reach kids and build a youth group that didn't really exist in the form that we thought it would. And that happened. And this summer, we saw 15 kids commit to Christ and 17 get baptized at Camp Hope. Because somebody said yes. Because somebody said it is more blessed to give than receive. Giving is good. This is someone who doesn't have kids in youth group. Someone who doesn't get a direct benefit except for the blessing of being part of what God's doing. I'm truly convinced that giving's good. I've experienced it over and over and over again. But you know what? There's interdependence at work right now. We are coming to the end of that generous gift that was given 2 years ago. And we believe that there's lots more work to be done with the youth of our city. And so I'm coming to you also with humility saying, we can't do this alone. We have to do this together. And your gifts, when you say yes to God and you give out of what you have, not what you don't have, we can make a difference together and point to how generous God is. So we're passing out a card in church called the Giving Experience. For those of you online, I'm going to walk you through it. We're challenging ourselves to stretch our giving and see what God does. I'm not asking that anyone in any way put themselves in debt or do anything that isn't provided for by God. But would you sit down with the Lord, look at your resources, and ask him where he might be asking you to stretch to give? Many of us are looking at our resources and either starting to give because we call BG4 our home, but we hadn't done that before, or raising our giving an additional 2% of our income. Perhaps if you are giving 10%, for the next 6 months, you could stretch to give 12% or something like that. Each of us will have that conversation with the Lord and ask him what our stretch is. And then we also want to be giving regularly to those in need. And we're going to have many opportunities for that through the upcoming arrival. What I hope for is that this will generate stories about the way that God provided. And that you are going to find that you do not come up shortchanged, but instead you get to experience how generous God is and find out, like many of us have already experienced, that giving is so good.